Welcome back. For those of you who've been trying to follow this YouTube channel regularly, you may have noticed this episode has been a long time coming, as the original audio podcast with Daniel Zavattiero was released several weeks ago. I'd been having trouble with my video editing software, and I think I've got it working for myself now. In any case, what you may notice is that this interview was not conducted as a split-screen Skype interview. My guest was kind enough to invite me into his house such that we could record the interview in person. And this is something I like to do whenever the opportunity presents itself. This episode's guest is Daniel Zavattiero. He is the Managing Director, Uranium, at the Minerals Council of Australia. And during this conversation, we discuss what MCA does, what uranium is, where you can find it, and a whole host of other things. I hope you enjoy it. The current estimates suggest that Australia holds approximately 30% of the world's uranium, the largest share held by a single nation. Yet this resource, wholly produced for export, is a tiny fraction of our total exports, even compared just with iron ore and coal. Australia is only the third largest exporter of uranium, behind Canada and Kazakhstan. Today, to discuss the lucky country's wondrous yellow hoard, I am joined by Executive Director, Uranium, of the Minerals Council of Australia, Daniel Zavattiero. Thank you for being on Going Fission.
Great to be here, Logan.
All right. So, first question. You've been in the mining game for a very long time. Would you care to elaborate on your career history?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having us on, and looking forward to this chat. I think it'll be good fun. I had a long career with BHP, starting in the early 90s and through to 2013, actually. But most of it was, almost all of it was in sales and marketing, really. So had a particularly long time in iron ore from the late 90s through to the mid-2000s, which was a fascinating time to be in the iron ore industry because it went from being an industry that was really dominated by Japan in particular to one, and the second half of that period was really saw the rise of China become a really prominent player in the iron ore space. And there's a lot of commercial conventions around that industry were sort of undergoing a lot of change. Used to be an annual pricing system, going to a very tradable commodity later on in that period, and that's continued on since then. So that was really fascinating. But then I had a few other changes and moves and looking at different commodities, and I finished up selling uranium for the last couple of years of my time at BHP, and I just thought it was a fascinating commodity. Particularly coming from iron ore to uranium was quite interesting because iron ore, today Australia is doing about 2 million tonnes a year. 2 million tonnes a day of iron ore, just about 1.5 to 2 million tonnes of shipping huge per day. And when I was selling it and involved with it, we were hundreds of thousands of tonnes a day, 80, 90 million tonnes a year. What was at the time I was involved. So that's the scale of things that that it takes in the modern world to build the world's modern cities and bridges and infrastructure. And then I went from that, so through various other moves, and then ended up in uranium. And then you start to look at uranium and you're told, well, 60,000 tonnes of uranium powers about 10 or 11% of the world's electricity. And I'm sitting there going, 60,000 tonnes? That's like less than half of an iron ore ship, of which we're doing several, 10 a day sort of things across Australia, and then more out of Brazil and whatnot. So, the energy density of uranium really captivated me as I started to learn more and more about the commodity. And then, of course, the environmental benefits that come from that. You just don't need a lot of uranium to generate so much energy. And that's what really captivated me in the industry. And that's how I guess I went from being an iron ore and uranium marketing guy from BHP to then subsequently coming into the uranium advocacy space that I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years.
That's really interesting. You said something earlier just then when you were talking about Japan. You said we were sort of competing with Japan. Now, Japan has no natural resources. How are we competing with Japan?
No, I wasn't saying we were competing with them. I was saying that we were selling iron ore to Japan, and it was one of the major customer bases. So it was very influential in, and still is. It's a big consumer of Australian iron ore and Brazilian iron ore. So it was a big basin for supply. The Japanese steel mills were the world's best. and they were providing a lot of steel both in Japan but also for export. So they were a big customer, and they were very well organised. So they had a lot, for 30, 40 years were critical in establishing the conventions for the commercial arrangements of how iron ore business was done. And I guess what I was saying was that that started to change as China imports of iron ore. I keep swapping iron ore and uranium. Of iron ore became more and more prominent. I remember one year. Japan was importing about 110 million tons of iron ore a year, and one year the Chinese increase was that size. And I remember thinking at the time, going, "My goodness." The iron ore imports just grew by the entire size of the Japanese market in this particular year. So that's the sort of thing that was happening early on in the 2000s. And really no one had sort of seen full. So everyone saw Chinese growth coming, but the scale of it, I think, was pretty much underestimated by everyone. And it was a fascinating period. I've never put pen to paper on iron ore, on the iron ore industry and the developments of that time, but it was just a really interesting time to be in it. And so, not a competitor, but an important customer, and still to this day, a really important customer for Australian commodities in general.
That's significant as well, because as I understand it, iron ore is the single largest export of Australia. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, iron ore and coal are very close, and coal in recent years has really grown substantially as well. Remember, of course, with coal, there's really two parts to it. There's the metallurgical coal and thermal coal. And most international coal production, or most coal production in the world, is thermal coal for energy generation. Australia is a massive producer of metallurgical coal, particularly out of Queensland. More than 50% of Queensland's exports are metallurgical coal. And so when you look at our coal export profile compared to other big exporting countries, most of other big exporting countries, it's all thermal coal, energy generation coal. But for us, a big component, I'm not sure if it's more than 50%, is metallurgical coal. So and metallurgical coal commands a premium over thermal coal. So it's a very important industry for Australia, and really important for our trade. We often forget that, countries don't buy our commodities because they want to be nice to us. They're buying our commodities because there's a great demand for it. Our commodities generally are quality-wise are really good. Australia's coal is some of the best in the world. Certainly metallurgical coal is fantastic, and premium coal in the world. And our energy coal is very high quality as well. Our iron ore is geographically very closely located to the major growth centres, from Pilbara into Asia. So Australia's got lots of good advantages in the mining space in general, in the old days, the tyranny of distance. The great demand centres were America or Europe, but in the last 20, 30, 40 years, the great demand centres have been the rise of Asia, and the industrialisation and urbanisation that's gone in Asia. So the tyranny of distance for our country has really flipped around in more recent times as Asia's grown and blossomed, and we've been able to supply critical raw materials to enable that growth, which is something I think a lot of Australians don't recognise and probably aren't as proud about as much as they should be, I think.
Excellent. And just briefly, so the main difference between your thermal and your metallurgical coal is obviously your metallurgical coal is essentially premium coal that you need to convert your iron to steel.
Exactly. So there's a nice synergy there that... and our metallurgical coal is predominantly in Queensland, and our iron ore assets are in Australia, are predominantly in the West. There used to be talk about maybe we could build a rail line from one to the other and have steel mills on either side, right? But in the end, I think it's just evolved that commercially it was more beneficial to see Australian resources developed and exported to countries that sort of added that kind of value. What we've actually seen is in a different kind of way, evaluating going on in what's called the MET sector, the mining equipment technology services sector. So you've seen a lot of that growth. And so when sometimes people talk about mining in Australia, they think of just the sort of minerals that are extracted. But we've actually developed, not the mining industry per se necessarily, but as a customer and an industry has developed around that, providing technology and services and equipment that's world's best. And I think some analysis we did a couple of years ago, that was done a couple of years ago, said that something like 10% of the country is employed in the mining and met sector combined, which is a huge amount, and really reflects the value, I guess, the value add that has spun out of having a strong mining sector that we've had. So, but yes, metallurgical coal goes together with iron ore to make steel. It's the predominant form for making iron and steel in the world today. You can make steel with the other way of making steel is through electric arc furnaces, where you are using scrap steel, for example, also some HBI, hot briquetted iron. But the key raw material there is electricity. So the key power source there is electricity. Whereas in the blast furnace route, which is Japan and South Korea and where all our iron, when you're using iron ore, you're going the blast furnace route, and there the power source is predominantly coking coal, which is manufactured from metallurgical coal. So yeah, it gets pretty technical and pretty geeky pretty quick, Logan, as you can tell.
Absolutely not a problem. It's it's good. Okay, better get away from coal, as should the nation.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, go on.
What role does the Minerals Council of Australia, or MCA, play in terms of uranium and more for resources more broadly?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of questions there. I guess the MCA is the peak body for the mining industry, for the resources sector in Australia. We cover about 85% of Australia's mining production. So the MCA has been around for quite a few decades now, and evolving over that time, of course. The relationship with uranium is a little bit more recent. MCA was always, supportive of uranium, but in recent times there was a merger in late 2013 of the Australian Uranium Association, which went from 2006 to 2013. It merged into the MCA at the end of 2013, and that's when I became involved with the MCA and the advocacy for uranium. So just to go back on the AUA itself, so it was formed, the uranium industry around 2005 and 6 thought we should have an association, we should have a body where we get together and look at things like industry standards and advocacy and whatnot, and so they formed their own group, the AUA, and that went through to 2013, and after that the CEO was moving on to other things, and rather than continue on that way, the AUA members agreed that it would be good to merge into the larger organisation, which was the MCA, and that's when I came in. So I guess that's the history in a nutshell and how I came to be involved with it. It's been interesting 4.5 years or so. As I said, the MCA it does cover all of Australia's commodities effectively. The big ones, of course, are iron ore and coal, both met and thermal coal, but also copper. Uranium's not a big commodity in terms of volume and value. I often describe it as a high-value, low-volume commodity. So it's a heavy metal. All of Australia's uranium exports, about 400 containers a year. We ship out in containers, not in large bulk ports like iron ore and coal do. Australia's exports are about $500 million to $1 billion a year. And it doesn't seem like a lot when you look at coal and iron ore, around $50 billion type commodities per annum. But it's a critical raw material for nuclear power generation. And our 7,000 tonnes or so a year, does oscillate a little bit up and down, but around 7,000 tonnes of Australian uranium would generate about the same amount of power that Australia consumes in terms of electricity. So 250 terawatt hours. So just in 7,000 tonnes of uranium. So you compare that to the amount of coal or gas you need when you're generating large amounts of power. It's quite an extraordinary commodity in that sense. But the MCA, in terms of all these other commodities, we're very neutral in the way we approach these things. We're not anti any commodity. We're very much we're very much a market-based organisation. We believe that that market dynamics can pull through the kind of commodities that are most efficient for use in various applications. So right now, coal has been a very very strong commodity this century in particular. I talked about that growth in Asia. I think a lot of that growth has been fueled by coal in China, for example. And I think some of that's balancing out. I think coal is clearly going to have a strong role to play in the years ahead. But we see countries like China and India that are looking at all the sort of suite of energy resources to develop. These countries are massive populations. They're still urbanising and developing their infrastructure. I think they see that it's important to have a diversity in these in the technology space around what's going to work in the future, and so that's why those countries are very interested in all these technologies, and including new coal technologies. To be fair, I mean, a coal plant built today is very different to one built 40 years ago in terms of the efficient use of coal, the emissions profile you're going to get from that. So a lot of these countries these developing countries have the advantage that they're building new plants rather than living off older ones, in the sense of some of the efficiency numbers you get from that. So but from our perspective, we're technology neutral in that sense, and we support Australia having policies that enable the safe and sustainable development of resources particularly for export markets that are growing rapidly, and most of them in our region at the moment. So I think, am I covering everything you want?
No, this is really good. I mean, it's absolutely fair to say that, yes, okay, Australia wants to decarbonise our fuel, so we want to break our addiction to coal, as does many other places in the world. But, yeah, it's absolutely right. You can't do that overnight. You can't do that in 2 years. You can't do that in 5 years. It will probably take at least 20 years, or 30, or 50. So, yeah, during that time, it's absolutely it makes absolutely perfect sense to support the commodity.
And I think I think the other thing is there's a lot of technology development going on in the coal space as well, around CCS, for example, carbon capture and storage. And there's good examples of that happening. It's a challenge, but that's the interesting thing about this space. I mean, it's easy to pick holes in an advocate's position on something, right? But the reality is there's almost no free lunch. Everything has challenges. We know the challenges with coal around CCS. We know the challenges with nuclear and uranium. The recent projects that have gone up around the world, a lot of them have gone over budget. They're complex projects. So you've got a lot of good research around, well, how can we drop costs out of the capital program for nuclear plants, and so some people are saying, well, you just got to build more of them so you get scale economies over time. Others are pretty hopeful around small modular reactors, the idea of building them in factories and then installing them on a site. That could be a good cost. There could be some really good cost benefits there as well. So there are challenges in the nuclear space, there's no doubt about it. There's some good success stories. I think the UAE is a really good success story where effectively that country's gone from go to woe. In, say, 15 years, they'll have 4 big nuclear power plants built for them, and pretty much, I believe, on budget. There's been a little bit of delay in more recent times, but a lot of that's around training rather than the actual construction program. So that project's on balance looking very successful in terms of cost and economics and construction times. And then on the other side, when you look at renewable energy resources, we've seen that those also come with a lot of challenges, particularly around intermittency. So even though we've seen some good cost reductions around the world in terms of solar panels and wind resources, and the capital involved with rolling out these things, there are challenges with integrating them into a system, into these grid systems that we have predominantly in the Western world today. So there's no free lunch. Everything's got challenges, and I think it's clear that in the years ahead, there's a place for all these technologies. And one of the things I keep reminding people when I talk to them is, there's 7 billion of us on the planet. There's still 1 billion people with virtually no access to electricity, and most people are projecting another 2 billion people coming onto the planet within, by 2050. So the demand for energy is going to be enormous. It's already enormous. And when we look at electricity versus energy, you see a lot of energy now is oil. So a lot of people say, well, not only is there a great demand for electricity, but we need to electrify more industries. So, for example, when you talk about electric vehicles, you're talking about electrifying the transportation sector and moving it off petroleum products, for example, and onto electricity. So you've got potential new sources of demand coming in addition to the fact that we have a lot of people with no electricity. So I think even with the sort of efficiencies that people talk about, you can't underestimate the amount of demand that's going to come into the world system for electricity. And frankly, I think that's a good thing in the sense that means more people living better lives around the world, more people with clean water, with power that they can use, and they can, the better health outcomes. These are all the benefits that we get from electrifying our lives. And the fact that more people can have access to that is not necessarily a bad thing. We often hear about the drain on resources. I think the world will find those resources, and it's getting better at extracting them safely and in an environmentally sustainable way. So I'm pretty optimistic about a lot of this stuff in terms of the outlook. Mainly because if you look at the last 20 years, it's been an extraordinary period. I talked about that Asian growth. Literally hundreds of millions of people, pretty much on our doorstep, are living much better lives than their parents were or their grandparents were, who were living in very, very poor countries. There's still a lot of development to go in those countries, don't get me wrong, but hundreds of millions of people have been given access to electricity in the last 2 decades, have been moving into urban areas, been getting better access to health and education. There's not a lot of talk about that in the world today. And Australia's benefited. Part of the reason we've had such a good period of economic growth is we opened up our economy, we made it a more efficient, competitive, we gave it a more efficient and competitive platform, and we've benefited from this demand that came into our natural resources sector. So there you go, I'm waffling on a fair bit.
No, it's fine. It's great. All right, so uranium.
Yep.
Where does it come from?
Everywhere. It's yeah, you can find it in a lot of places. But the world's uranium industry is largely, the largest producers, Kazakhstan and Canada, as you mentioned, and Australia's third. We've got the largest resource base, about a third of the world's known resources. But look, the thing about resources is, you find, the more you look for, the more you find them, right? So, the world thought it was going to run out of a lot of resources in the 1970s. We've actually got more resources than we thought we had then, and we've used more than we had then. So exploration generates more and more deposits and finds more and more, and technology development finds new ways of making previously uneconomic resources and deposits economic in terms of how to use them if they're problematic with impurities or various other things commingled in them, and also in terms of extracting them. So. But for us, rich in uranium resources and still highly prospective. We've got a lot of parts of the country where we don't know what's underneath. And people talk about Olympic Dam, which is a huge deposit in South Australia. And a lot of people think, it's pretty odd that there would just be one of those types of deposits. So there's a view that there could be several others like that out and around, not just South Australia, but in Australia generally. So. Uranium is, we've got a lot of it. There's a few other countries with quite a bit of it as well. But the other big one that people are realising more is actually there's a lot of it in the ocean. Yeah. In fact, it's arguably the largest resource. There's about 4 billion tonnes of uranium in Earth's oceans at something like 0.003 parts per million. And plenty of people have, over the years, when they were concerned about long-term uranium supply, have investigated the idea of extracting some of that, and there's been some interesting progress around that, although it is expensive. So until the price or the cost of mining of uranium becomes prohibitive, it would probably be better to mine than to try and extract it from the oceans. But interestingly, from the oceans, if you started to take uranium out of the oceans, you would have like millions of years of supply probably, because it's in a static equilibrium. So the more you take out, the more it would leach out or bring out from the Earth itself. So crazy. There are some people arguing that when you look at it that way, uranium is actually effectively a renewable resource until the entire planet leached all of its uranium out, which would be, as I said, millions of years. So it's a fascinating commodity in that sense too. But it also helps I like to talk about that because it helps demystify it a little bit. People think, well, yeah, uranium's a scary thing. Well, it's actually at the beach. It's in the water. It's in the seawater.
You're swimming in it.
You're swimming in it. That's right. So so it is. But it's good. It's still a good opportunity for Australia because, as I said, we've got those good resources. We've got several projects. We've had several decades now producing uranium, supplying it to the world safely and sustainably. We've got really good credibility around non-proliferation, highly respected. In that space around the world as being a responsible participant in the nuclear fuel cycle. Collaborate and cooperate with other jurisdictions, in Europe and North America around making sure that uranium doesn't go to where it shouldn't go. So that's a good. That part of it is, and I think that part's been particularly important in recent decades in helping people feel more comfortable that this is a commodity that we can produce safely and doesn't end up in weapons and whatnot. It goes to, every country we sell uranium to, we have a treaty with specifically for.
This is in excess or in addition to
the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's right. In addition to that, that's right. So it's not sufficient to just have that. We have to have a bilateral agreement with that country that gives us, that provides additional obligations. So that's pretty unique. If you're buying uranium from Australia, you are committed to using it only for peaceful purposes, and that's been very successful. So look, it's a good space to be in. I think there's great opportunities. It'll never be the size of iron ore and coal. Those are big mega industries. But it can certainly be a commodity and an industry that can grow from a strong base that we're on now. We're a supply source that a lot of countries want to have relationships with and want to procure from. So it's just a matter of making sure we have the right regulatory, an efficient regulatory system in place and bring those projects through as the market calls for them. Yeah.
One thing that I probably have to bring this up because I know someone will pick me up if I don't. We have a very special relationship with India in terms of our iron ore export. Would you like to comment on that?
Iron ore?
Sorry.
No, you're doing
it. You got me.
No,
in terms of uranium.
Well, India is a different country because it didn't sign the NPT. So we have an exception for India in terms of Australian policy, the federal government policy, where we have allowed India to go ahead and we've pursued a bilateral agreement. So we still have a bilateral agreement with India that kind of mirrors the arrangement we have with other countries. But they haven't signed the NPT for historical reasons. For those who aren't really, au fait with what the NPT was, it's the Non-Proliferation Treaty came in, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. And it basically was an international treaty that allowed all countries to have access and collaborate and cooperate around the peaceful use of nuclear technology. But only 5 countries, which were the 5 countries that at the time had nuclear weapons, were allowed to keep them. No other countries were to have them. So everyone could, if you signed the NPT and you were a non-weapons country, you were basically signing away your right to create nuclear weapons. And most countries did that. And some argue that the NPT was probably the greatest success story that the UN has to promote, because actually it did lead to. I think Kennedy, JFK thought in the early 60s, he said by the end of this decade we could have 20, 30 countries with nuclear weapons. But the NPT was one of the things that really was quite successful in restricting the number of countries that had nuclear weapons. And so we had those 5. There are a few extra companies that came in addition to that. India's one of them. India and Pakistan. I remember, and partly because they missed that window effectively, or particularly India just missed that window. And I guess for many years they were on the outer as a consequence of that, and they weren't part of the civil nuclear global industry. But in more recent terms, they created their defence industry around. They created their nuclear defence industry, and after three decades or so, I think some of the key parties decided it was time that we're not going to restrict them now. That what's done is done. It's time to now perhaps bring them into the circle and try and manage that as best we can. So I think that's kind of a bush history of some of this. But yeah, that's where India is a little bit unique in the sphere of things. But so Australia has a bilateral, but so at this stage we haven't had shipments commence. But that could happen in the years to come. And it's got a growing nuclear industry, civilian nuclear power industry, with several reactors under construction. And I think over time it'll be a good market for us as well.
So you said, so we've got the agreement with them. I thought we were exporting uranium. Have we actually not done that yet?
Not that yet. No, only I think only sort of test sample type type arrangements. Nothing, no real shipments per se.
It's look, the whole international politics around around uranium export and the politics around the NPT is probably an episode in itself.
It is.
Thanks very much for giving us a crash course.
No, that's fine.
It's good. All right, can you give us a crash course in the nuclear fuel cycle from mine to reactor?
Crash course.
Yeah.
Well, you probably know all this already, but I guess, yeah. I mean, look, so I think it starts with mining. You mine uranium. Then there's an element of processing that occurs, so conversion to a gas, and then using that material to enrich the uranium from a 0.7% U-235, which is the key isotope in nuclear power, used in nuclear power plants, to about 3%. And once you've got that in, which we call low enriched uranium, or LEU, once you've got that LEU, you then go to the next stage, which is fuel fabrication, which is to create these the fuel cells, and then that gets put into the reactors for power generation. And then going around further into the cycle, after that you've got spent fuel. So once that U-235 is largely depleted in the fuel cell and fissioned away, you've got spent fuel, which is still the same. It's not like ashes or anything, but it's highly radioactive, these fuel cells, and they need to be managed carefully. So I think it's basically keeping them in spent fuel pools for 5 to 10 years, and then after that into spent fuel casks. And then from there on, what do you do with that? Well, there's a whole host of different options. Some countries reprocess, like the French, which is to take those fuel cells and break them up for their constituent parts and use the uranium or some plutonium that might have developed as well, which is also fissionable. And then you've got the fission products, which is a real final waste, which is only about 3% of the spent fuel. And you look at permanent disposal in deep geological repositories, essentially, for that. A lot of people talk about waste, and what about the waste? I actually think the waste is one of the great strengths of nuclear power, which is a bit bit strange, because people sort of look at you a bit strange when you say that. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. One is there's so little of it, and this is the energy density I was talking about earlier. People talk about the waste in nuclear power, but in actual fact, there's not that much of it. Even the United States, the largest nuclear power country in the world, they could put all of their waste from 50, 60 years of nuclear power generation on a football field, something like 15 feet high. So it's just not a lot of waste to manage. And so because volumetrically it's not that much to manage, it is something that the world tends to manage quite well. The other thing is you can do reprocessing. Some countries prefer to do reprocessing, like the French. Others prefer to keep it all commingled and just bury it. I think the Finns, for example, are looking to build a deep geological repository and just bury that for possibly forever, or possibly someone might want to go there in the future to extract it, because there's still a lot of U-238 that could be a potential energy resource in the future. The US also don't do reprocessing. They're probably also looking at deep geological repository solutions as well. So there's a whole host of different opportunities and challenges and projections of what can go on in various parts of the cycle. So for Australia, we're only in the upstream. I guess we're up in the mining space.
The front end.
The front end.
Yep.
It depends which end you look at it from.
Yep.
But yeah, we're at one extreme only, just in the mining space. It's an area we've developed good expertise in. And we also, of course, have the Lucas Heights Medical Research Reactor that is really important for us as well. It's generating vital medicines and radioisotopes for industrial applications and various other uses. The reactor that they have there at the moment is probably 10 or 15 years old. It's a newer reactor, fantastic, probably the world's best reactor of its kind. So that's kind of the nuclear space that we're in. And as you indicated earlier, we don't really we sort of have a stop-start discussion around other potential in the nuclear space, around nuclear power or other parts of other potential areas we can participate in the cycle. So
we have a very peculiar relationship to the technology.
We do have a bit of a peculiar relationship to it. We kind of revisit it. It's a political challenge sometimes. We had the Royal Commission in South Australia a couple of years ago, which was quite positive, even though it's kind of been parked a little bit for the time being. But it's it's something I think it identified some opportunities that won't necessarily just disappear, and that we can potentially revisit in the future again. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, I guess, as we go along. But yeah,
for sure. All right. Marketing a commodity as tightly controlled as uranium must differ from marketing other energy-dense fuels, such as, for instance, Red Bull.
Yes, it is different to marketing Red Bull. It is.
Or coal, if we want to be serious.
Well, coal is a very energy-dense fuel, right? I mean, it's there's no doubt about it. But uranium is off the charts, even compared to coal and all the fossil fuel, oil, gas. Uranium's off the charts, and it's a different technology. It's fission. It's not combustion, right? So that's pretty critical. But yeah, with respect to Red Bull, yes, it's not retail. It's not. But it's marketing business to business. So compared to say iron ore, for example, not too dissimilar. I used to sell iron ore, and my customers were Japanese steel mills, or European steel mills, or Chinese steel mills. When I sold uranium, my customers were nuclear utilities. So energy companies that would buy, and a lot of those energy companies would have not just nuclear plants; they would have coal plants and gas plants and renewable plants as well. So when you talk to them and say, "Why don't you go out there and promote nuclear more?" They say, "Well, that's like promoting one of my children over the other children," which was an interesting perspective. But yeah, marketing uranium is business to business. The logistics is different. It's not a bulk commodity like coal and iron ore, and even copper concentrates, for example, which is shipped in bulk. This is containerized, packaged, and whatnot. And with respect to it's interesting. One thing I did find interesting that yes, uranium has more government oversight in terms of the non-proliferation, the safeguards arrangements. But when you're selling uranium, you actually don't feel that so much. There's about 400 plus reactors in the world. Everyone knows where they are. Everyone knows who owns them. So you'd go to conferences and you talk. You know who you're talking to. You know the potential buyers. So the government relationships in the background that monitored, from a safeguards perspective, what was going where. Really didn't have that much of an impact on your day-to-day negotiation of contracts and commercial arrangements for the sale and delivery of uranium, which was I was a little bit surprised by that actually. The one thing you do need to, from an Australian perspective, is you might talk to the government, particularly as new countries come into the global world. So, like UAE, for example, is now about to commission its first few reactors. So that's the sort of thing that 10, 15 years ago, Australian producers would speak to the government and say, "Are you talking to the UAE? That could be a potential market." So they'll go and talk to the UAE and create that sort of the framework and the foundations for an eventual bilateral agreement. Most of the countries who have civilian nuclear power plants have bilateral agreements with Australian supply. So there's no. If that was different, if we only had agreements with a few countries, then that would be. I think that would have a high impact on the way the market worked. But because most people are in the tent, the obligations are clear. It works pretty well from the perspective of developing those commercial relationships and supplying against them. So yeah, it's good. Does that work?
Yeah, no, it's really great. It's great. Where am I?
I'm down at Trent, which is not good. Sunday afternoon, jeez.
Well, look, would you like to get another one? I can.
We're going to pause?
Yeah, we can pause it.
And you need another one too. Okay,
yeah,
pause.
All right, do it. We are back again and we are recharged.
We are recharged.
Recharged and refreshed. So So
with no sponsors, right? But if anyone wants to sponsor this podcast, I'm sure Logan's open to offers.
We'll see how we go. In Australia, mining is a contentious issue at the best of times. Could you care to elaborate on the history of uranium mining?
Well, yeah, uranium. We often talk about modern uranium mining starting from about the 1980s, but in Australia, I think it goes back to 1906 in terms of some uranium extracted at Radium Hill in South Australia for production of radium. But then after World War II, there was uranium extracted for UK weapons programs, for example. And then in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of exploration that was going on. The 70s was a particularly important period because you had the oil shocks. So energy costs around the world dramatically rose, and people start to become concerned around energy and energy security. Around that time, Australia really started to think about it. And interestingly, a lot of people probably don't realise that federal governments in Australia were quite pro-uranium at the time. Whitlam government was pro-uranium, and his Resources Minister Rex Connor wanted to look at uranium development and enrichment, even in Australia. But then probably around the late 70s, a lot of political upheaval in the mid-70s in Australia. In the late 70s, there was a famous inquiry, the Fox inquiry, and out of that, from around the early 80s on, Australia's basically uranium export policy sort of was developed out of that and has been largely in place since that time, has evolved slightly around that time. But from around the 1980s onwards, the idea of Australia developing uranium and supplying it to the world markets on the basis of bilateral agreements in place, the signing of the NPT, all those sorts of things were basically in place. There's been a little bit of... there were some times there when, during the Labor government of the 80s and 90s, the three mines policy was in place, which kind of restricted the growth of the uranium industry and its potential. But then post that period, from the Howard government onwards in 96, that sort of reopened federally. And we've had pretty good federal consensus on uranium development. And even as we touched on before, Australia's opening up of relationships with India around uranium was started under the Labor government.
Crazy.
So, interesting.
Traditionally, they've always been against uranium and
correct.
The nuclear fuel cycle.
Well, that's right. The three mines policy of the 80s and 90s for Labor turned into, actually now we're even going to consider supplying uranium to India, provided we can get the right safeguards and arrangements in place to feel comfortable that it can be done safely and sustainably, etc. So federally, I think there's a lot of there's some consensus that uranium is an important commodity, and I think that's around trade. It's around the fact that our trading partners, the people that our federal politicians deal with on a daily basis, see that it's important, and they see that Australian resources, not just iron ore and coal, but uranium is important. So I think that federally that message has really gotten through. Around the states, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. Obviously in South Australia, long time, we've had Olympic Dam and Heathcote Resources, and Honeymoon was another in situ recovery operation that's now in care and maintenance that could be coming back on in the years to come. So in South Australia, there's pretty good state consensus from bipartisan consensus around uranium being an important commodity, and also in the NT, similar consensus. But in the other states, we've been off and on. So a coalition or a Liberal government in WA removed the ban on uranium mining, and the Labor government's put it back in. And similarly in Queensland, the Newman government took the ban off uranium exploration and mining, and the new government came in and put it back in. So a little bit stop-start in those jurisdictions. Our industry continues to talk to those parties. We continue to prosecute our case, sort of case that you and I have been talking about in the last 40 minutes or so. We think it's a valuable commodity. It's good for Australia to continue to develop. There's good jobs, most of them in regional economies that can use that development. And in fact, we see good support for uranium mining in those regions where the jobs are and where the developments can take place. So we continue to prosecute that case. We know our trading partners are interested in Australia as a source of uranium and other commodities. And so I think in the long run, we're hopeful that it'll continue to normalise. I mean, the long arc of history in this space is one of normalisation, right? We've seen, as we just talked about, we saw Labor federally move to a position of normality on how this commodity can be traded with our trading partners, and we've seen that we've seen Lucas Heights become more accepted in the outer suburbs of Sydney. We've seen nuclear medicine become more understood and how important it is in our health system today. So I think the long arc is one of continuing understanding, continuing normalisation of anything in the uranium and nuclear spaces in this country. So it's a slow arc, but it's still I think evolving that way positively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree 100% with that. It's when I was doing a master's and I'd talk to people randomly and say, "Oh, I'm doing a master's of engineering." They'd say, "Oh, okay, what discipline? What part of engineering you do?" I said nuclear, and they'd look at you as if to say you just said, "Oh, I study at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry."
Look, yeah, it is a bit. But how many people have you had say to you things like, "Oh yeah, I'm actually quite interested in nuclear," but you know,
most people I speak to,
there's almost like a closet.
It is. And I think it's something that the industry is really just starting to come to grips with. And,
yeah.
Oh my God, people actually want to speak about this, and that's really the main reason why I kicked this podcast off.
Yeah.
And so far, people seem to be responding to it. Early days, but people seem to be responding to it.
And that's where I think, people like Ben Hurd, who you had on your podcast, the first one,
It was a
been
fantastic
so
interview.
important, because they're good communicators around this space. They encourage the conversation, the communication. They encourage people to ask questions and to think about this in a normal way, to sort of let some of the fear, to unpack some of the fears that have been around this, that are almost culturally ingrained into us.
Definitely cultural.
And just allow that to sort of be open and discussed and see what the possibilities and opportunities are. And I think, and there's a lot of challenges, I think, because, it's one thing to also to look at it at a macro level. Should Australia look at nuclear power? But then also, if you say, well, yes, that's possibly the case, then at some point you're going to have to talk to communities who might host that. And that's not unique to nuclear power or uranium mining. This is I think the days where governments or companies impose things on unwilling communities in any space are virtually gone, in countries like Australia in particular. So I think this whole social element of engagement and normalising and allowing communities to be included and be part of the whole development conversation in any space, I think that's going to become something we have to deal with more and more. And this, we're going to have to build on good examples, good case studies, what's worked, what have some companies or governments done really well in other spheres. Grab those learnings and see how we can transpose them. And we're seeing some of that sort of stuff. We saw some of it in the the Nuclear Royal Commission, some really good outreach and engagement. And I think that'll be revisited at some point. But yeah, it's just one of those things. I think these sort of conversations are really important to have and to promote. So yeah, just got to keep doing it.
Very good. I agree, 100%.
So what have we got next?
Yep, Olympic Dam is a massive mine in South Australia.
Yep.
Can you elaborate on the multiple products that it produces?
Well, it's essentially a copper mine. And when I was selling uranium, I didn't like calling it a byproduct. I called it a co-product because I was selling uranium. But
That's marketing speak.
That's right. But it's not unusual to have mines that produce multiple products. We would call it a polymetallic ore body. And its key commodities key products are copper, gold, uranium, and silver. Silver less so. But there's even rare earths and whatnot. But the issue is, what can you commercially or economically extract? Because at the moment that's the way, and I think for the foreseeable future that's the way it's set up. But to produce those four key commodities, particularly the first three: copper, uranium, and gold. But yeah, it's a fantastic ore body. It'll have 100+ year life. So there's not that many ore bodies around the world that you sort of talk about that kind of life. It employs several thousand people in South Australia. It's a really important regional source of economic activity and development. And I think the fact that it's polymetallic also gives it an extra capability to sort of ride the cycle. I mean, a lot of mines producing one commodity. Commodities are often cyclical, so when prices are down, it can be economically challenging for them. Olympic Dam, with its multi-commodity profile, has an ability to have to sort of ride that a little bit more than some other products, some other ore bodies. So it's a fascinating ore body, and I think it's going to continue on for a long, long time in Australia.
It's a staggeringly large operation.
It is. And when I was selling uranium from Olympic Dam, my cousin used to call me Olympic Dan, which is pretty embarrassing, but...
Oh, that's cute.
So there you go.
Nice. All right, so in 2016, the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission didn't find an economic case for increased uranium mining or engaging other fuel cycle activities in South Australia, apart from the possibility of a spent fuel repository. What are your thoughts today on these findings?
Well, we touched on that, and the findings, I think, are a bit more complex than what you just summarised there. So it did look at the four sort of pieces, four components of the fuel cycle. So it looked at mining and exploration, all the things around mining. It looked at processing, which is conversion, enrichment, the things we talked about before, fuel fabrication. It looked at power generation, and it looked at waste. And it sort of tried to see what are the opportunities and risks and possibilities in those spaces. And in the end, the outcome was, it sort of summarise. If I summarise on the four, it basically came out and said, look, in the uranium mining space, there is more opportunity. And they basically said there'll be growth. South Australia is well positioned for that. There should be some streamlining of environmental approvals and whatnot with that the government should pursue. So it had a number of recommendations around streamlining that, but it also made the point that yes, that'll be good, it'll be important, but it's not really a game changer per se. It'll be particularly important for remote areas where there's where most of the jobs in mining are created. But in terms of the state, remember this was a Royal Commission, so they were looking at is there big game changing possibilities. For the state, they were looking that they didn't see that so much. We would argue that there is potentially still game-changing opportunities even in the uranium mining space alone. When you start to look at some of those climate-constrained energy models going forward, you look at the IEA, the IPCC, most of those guys are saying if we really want to deal with climate change, then nuclear is going to have to play a much more important role along with carbon capture and storage and renewables and whatnot. And when you start to look at some of those projections, you get a lot of uranium called for. And if South Australia attracts a lot of that investment demand, you could get some pretty substantial growth in the next 20, 30 years. So, but that was the uranium mining space. In the processing space, they didn't find a lot of opportunity in the next decade or so. Conversion enrichment is sort of well supplied. In fact, there's possible oversupply in those spaces. So they didn't sort of see too much opportunity. Although they did say we've kind of got bans on these things. We shouldn't have bans on them per se. I think they made recommendations around normalising the legislation around that.
148.
Well, that was nuclear power, which is the next one. So the nuclear power one is interesting because a lot of people say the headline is, nuclear power not viable. But that's not true. In fact, you preempted me on this, so I got the line here. This is in the Royal Commission report.
Okay.
The Commission did not find that nuclear power is too expensive to be viable or that it is yesterday's technology. Rather, it found that a nuclear power plant of currently available size at current costs of construction would not be viable in the South Australian market under current market rules. The outcome of this analysis is consistent with a wide range of realistic scenarios. It does not necessarily apply to other jurisdictions in Australia. In fact, some of the modelling suggests that nuclear might well be viable elsewhere, as the challenges facing baseload generation in South Australia are not shared with other regions of the NEM. Which is a fascinating conclusion. I love that line because most people aren't aware that the Royal Commission found that in other parts of the NEM, some modelling suggests that nuclear power is already viable today, which I think personally is a compelling case to say we should remove the prohibition right now. Because most people say there's a prohibition on it, but it's not economic, it's not urgent. Well, we've got a Royal Commission that said actually it could be viable in some parts of the country now. So I think that was quite a compelling finding that most people seem to gloss over. I did want to point that out, so for the podcast, if there's nothing else you get from this podcast, that's not a bad one.
I'm very glad you did.
So that was on power generation, and the other thing on the power generation is the Commission kind of restricted itself to looking at what's deployable now. And in the small modular reactor space, that's very much a developing space. NuScale is a reactor, a design that's probably the most well progressed in the US in terms of going through the approval process, the design approval process. But the Royal Commission said, well, we're not looking at that because it's not built now, it's not licensed, etc. So they only looked at the large 1+ gigawatt, essentially looked at those big 1+ gigawatt type plants, and they found that in South Australia that would be really challenging to put that kind of plant in there. But I guess that's where they thought, actually, but some of those plants might work elsewhere in the NEM. So I think from the Royal Commission perspective, it's important to realise that they discounted the idea of SMRs. And I think from the perspective of normalising the technology and allowing that possibility to occur in the future, we should remember they didn't really look at that, but it could well be that within the next 5 or 6 years, we could start to see some small modular reactor opportunities really developing in the world, particularly in the US, that could have real application for us in Australia. And they didn't really have a good look at that. Fair enough, I don't blame them for that, but that's just the way they approached it. They were looking for deployability now. And the final one was waste opportunities. And I think that got well reported, that the Royal Commission thought there was a great opportunity there. I think there still is a great opportunity there in Australia. There's a lot of people like Bob Hawke who think there's a great opportunity there. And one of the things for people who are anti-nuclear, they considered it a great win when the second citizens jury came back and said, we don't think we should look at this. But one of the things I always say is that opportunity doesn't just go away just because some people say it's not there. To the extent that opportunities exist, they'll always be considered until the opportunity disappears. Now, why would that opportunity disappear? Well, if someone else builds one, it might take that opportunity away from Australia. If countries go ahead and develop all their own repositories, that might reduce the opportunity. But I still think that potential is something that Australia could seriously consider, and it would be a great value add, not just for Australia, but for the world in general. I mean, it would mean that would be at the front end mining, and we'd be at the back end providing a solution there as well. Gareth Evans gave evidence at the Royal Commission saying if Australia could pull off this kind of arrangement, it would be it would be extremely welcomed in the world and would elevate our status in the world. Well, I think we're well regarded in the world anyway, but it would be something that the world would receive really positively. So I think that's still something that might get looked at again in the future. And as I said before, there's all these different things in the waste, right? There's burying the fuel rods, or there's fission products, there's reprocessing. So this isn't just a binomial sort of, it's either this or that. There's a lot of different possible sort of things that we can look at that might be looked at. And in fact, Australia itself has waste coming from Lucas Heights, a very, very small amount of waste coming from Lucas Heights in terms of the reprocessed fission products that come back. We're going to have to do something with that. So that's our own waste from our own reactor that's producing radioisotopes for Australian consumption. So at some point, we're going to look at this for ourselves anyway, if there's effectively like an export. Because that's what if we did something with waste, it would be like an export industry, right?
Oh, yeah.
The revenue would be coming from overseas. It would be foreign customers paying us for a service. So it would be effectively a giant new export industry if we pulled off something like that. But so the Royal Commission was fascinating. I think there was a lot of the attention went to the waste because there was a preliminary business case sort of put forward on what the potential could be. But I think there were some nuclear comments that were really interesting as well. And the recommendations in the end there were only 12 recommendations, and most of them were around normalising the legislative architecture, repealing 140A, just allowing these technologies to be considered on their merits. If they're economic and safe, we could do them properly, they would go ahead. If not, nothing's going to happen. So, the state government backed some of those recommendations, and others it didn't. But I think it was a vital piece of work that I think will get referred back to and revisited at some point.
And it's not been the only one. I believe in 2006 there was the Umpner report, which was a similar look into the
Ziggy report.
That's the one.
Yeah, I mean that was done by the federal government, and that was done mainly around nuclear power, I think, and that was so. That was, I think, and that's a good example. That report continues to be referenced today, and I think this Royal Commission, this South Australian-based Royal Commission, was. They interviewed a lot of people and took some really good expert evidence. And it's interesting when you look at the citizen that the government then underwent a sort of a wide consultation process statewide, and with two citizens juries, a smaller one initially with 50 odd people, and then a second one with 300 or so. And the smaller one was reasonably positive about, let's continue the conversation. We think these areas should be the main area of focus. And the second one. There's been a lot of comment on the second one. It didn't really it made it difficult for the conversation to continue immediately after that. I think interestingly that even in the second one, it wasn't around safety. It wasn't around a lot of the fear of radiation. It wasn't we shouldn't do this because we don't think we can do it safely. It was some of it broke down around probably a cynical view around the economics. We don't think the government can do this kind of thing. That the government's government can't build a hospital on time and on budget. How's it going to do this kind of venture? So that's quite a cynical sort of view that some people were able to be convinced of. And but it's interesting that some of those old fears of risk and radiation and whatnot actually weren't really identified as the reasons we shouldn't do this. And I think on that basis that there were some positive things to take out of that process. And that when when it gets revisited, I think some of that might be more important. So it's that's where it is, I guess.
Absolutely. In situ leach mining, it's a relatively new method of uranium mining. Could you tell us a little bit about its advantages, disadvantages, what it is?
Well, I could probably tell you as much as a sales marketing guy can tell you.
I'll take it.
Well, I mean, we have in situ recovery mining in Australia. In South Australia, looks like an above-ground plumbing system. There's no hole in the ground. People come there and say, "Where's the mine?" Well, you're kind of looking at it. It doesn't look like a mine, right? But I like to talk about it in the context of Australian uranium mining in general. So we have underground mining at Olympic Dam, which is tunnels. We had open pit mining in Northern Territory at the Ranger mine. So there's sort of the three main ways of extracting uranium, and we've had all three in the past. And in situ recovery is not unique to uranium only. It is used in other metal extraction as well. But it's become pretty common in the world, particularly around Kazakhstan, which is the largest producer in the world, and it's all in situ recovery. My understanding is that it's horses for courses. So some ore bodies are better to look at as open pits or undergrounds or in situ. So it's just whatever works at the time. And Australia's developed really good expertise in all of those areas. Because our uranium industry is a smaller part of a larger mining industry, we get a lot of best practice cross-fertilisation as well. So most people who've worked in the uranium industry have probably worked in other commodity mines as well. So it's something we can do. It's, even though the Kazakhs are doing a lot of it, it's something we do a lot of as well. And low impact, as I said, above ground plumbing. So you've got the advantages of minimal disturbance. There are other areas you've got to manage. So, as I said earlier, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So, all operations, all industrial operations, not just mining operations, all industrial operations have risks that you've got to manage. And ironically, radiation is not, well, particularly for ISR, radiation is not one of the significant ones. When you look at radiation exposures for workers or the public our operations are reasonably remote, but even you're looking at very, very low, if not indetectable type exposures for people when it comes to radiation. That's not to say there aren't other hazards, there aren't other environmental issues that you've got to manage. So it is about being, case site specific on what the issues to manage are. So ISR has a place. I think we'll be doing that for a long time in the years ahead. So it's operating now. We're doing ISR mining in South Australia now, and it'll keep going, I'm sure. So,
excellent. No, that was really good. All right, so what can the nuclear industry offer younger listeners who find themselves drawn to the technology but maybe are not cut out to be scientists or engineers?
Yeah, well, we can't all be sales marketing people, I guess. Look, I think it's a good question. I was thinking about that, and I was going to paraphrase JFK. Ask not what nuclear technology can do for you, but what you can do for nuclear technology.
I like it.
I think, in my case, I'm not a technical guy. I'm not a geologist or a metallurgist. So, but I came to this relatively late. But I was captured by or captivated by some of the science around it. So I think even if you're not a science or a technical person, developing a passion around this would be around some of the science and technology aspects of it. For me, energy density was an extraordinary thing, and I had a long career, as I said, in selling iron ore and coal. And I felt a real first-hand understanding of what it takes to build the modern world, and the benefits of the modern world in terms of what it brings the people of the world in terms of health and education and opportunity. And then when you come across to uranium and you see the energy density and what it can do, and then you see the nuclear medicine and the industrial applications, and you learn more and more from Lucas Heights and things like that, it's easy to become very passionate in this space. So I think for young people, even if you're not a science person, try and understand and appreciate the science and technology as much as you can, and become an advocate. Speak up. Like today, we're living in an era where people have a voice. Social media. I think it's a technology that needs more and more people to speak up about it. More and more people to speak about the benefits of it. And in Australia, in terms of nuclear technology, probably the main touch point for most people is health. So a lot of people know friends or relatives that are getting scans and getting treatment, getting diagnoses. Find out more about that. Find out more if it's coming from Lucas Heights. I know some people who have become who are anti-nuclear and have become pro-nuclear, and I've asked them what changed your mind after 20 years of being skeptical about this. Says, well, my wife got cancer, and I've started to look at some of the treatment she was getting, and it made me readdress some of the phobias and some of the prejudices that I had against this technology and this area of science. So I think for a lot of people, that's an area, that's a way that they can become more neutral around the space, rather than, as we said earlier, that sort of culturally, we're all kind of culturally a bit.
There's a cultural cringe.
There's a cultural doubt around it. And for a lot of people, you say, well, I don't really know much about it, but I'm supposed to be against it, aren't I? That's almost... And then you sort of have to talk through where you're at on it. So, but that's what that would be my advice, I think. And I think on that basis, I think there's going to be great employment opportunities. There'll be science and research and marketing and sales and advocacy opportunities, I think, in this space. Not just in energy, but in technology and applications, industrial applications, the nuclear medicine side of things. I think it's a rich field. It's not the only, obviously, not the only scientific field that's going to be more and more important in the world in the years ahead. But I think, given the benefits that we get from such a small amount of raw material, it's going to be it's going to be so important in the years to come. Why? Because there's more people coming onto the planet. More and more, we as humans want to look after our environment. We want to make sure that there's space for nature, and we become, as time goes on, we're becoming more and more aware of environmental outcomes and protecting species and all these sort of wants and desires. I think nuclear is really important. It's low impact. Its potential is huge in that space. So get on board, study, read as much as you can, and talk to people as much as you can. That's my advice.
Nice.
So what you're doing is really good, Logan. I have to say it's a great innovation, and it's really appreciated from people like myself and Ben and others. I think who've been in this space for a while. I wish you all the best, and I'll be looking forward to seeing all these podcasts coming up.
Thank you very much. Look, before we go, I'm going to hit you with one more question.
One you haven't...
Which I haven't actually addressed yet, I'm sorry,
right,
but it shouldn't be too bad, because I think you've already half answered it already.
Mm-hmm.
Could you give me 2 to 3 people that you reckon I should invite to the podcast?
Well, I think there's people that I haven't met. Rod Adams, I think, in the US is someone I follow online. And I've seen some of the things he's talked about. He would be really interesting.
Atomic Rod.
I'd love to meet him one day. Jessica Lovering from the Breakthrough Institute.
Yes.
She could be in Australia next year sometime. So that might be something you might be able to tee up. I really recommend that. Robert Bryce is someone that the Minerals Council that I've met, and he talks. I think he's written some books. He's at the Manhattan Institute. He's written a lot in various US papers, an energy expert, and he's really good around the sort of the future role of dense energy sources and what it takes to feed and power a modern world with 7, 8, 9 billion people, and I think it's fantastic. So it could give you plenty more, but there's a lot of people to talk to. Jeff Curry is fantastic. I don't know if you've met Jeff.
I haven't met Jeff, but Ben did suggest you need to speak to this person.
Yeah, I'm not giving you...
Chase him up. I've got to chase him up.
So have I given you anyone that you haven't got yet, or
just Dr. Jeff Curry?
Jeff Curry?
Just Dr. Jeff Curry. That's the only double.
Yeah, Jeff's on nuclear medicine. He's fantastic on that. So A.D. Patterson at Lucas Heights would be great. There's plenty of people, and I'm sure more and more will come out over the next few months.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Daniel Zavattiero, it's been a pleasure to have you on Going Fission. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Leighton. Great, mate. Good on you. Cheers.